There should be laughter after pain. There should be sunshine after rain. These things have always been the same. So why worry now? Dire Straits.
Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stewart. Episode 21. The Phoenix Principle. Schumpeterian Renewal. How innovation and progress spring back stronger, leaner, smarter from the ashes of seeming setbacks. It's been 20 episodes now on this journey as part of exploring Ash's technocentric view of human progress and innovation, where both artifactual and institutional developments fall under the purview of the word technology, defined in its broadest sense. We started at the very beginning by exploring the first tools devised by man, made of what we'd now think of as crude stone. Let's step back and see how far we have come and what lies ahead.
Leaving no stone unturned. That earliest stone tool was a turning point in the human story. You could even say that's a quintessential part of what separated us from other primates, other animals as a whole. We commemorate that milestone by calling it the Stone Age, with our friend Steve showing us how it was done. After discussing that in TecC 03, I took the next 4 episodes to set the stage and give a taste of what we will be exploring before resuming the story in a chronological fashion, covering innovations such as the control of fire, agriculture, and domestication of animals, before moving to the next stage in the story, the Bronze Age. Under this banner, with the help of our new friends Brian, Bruno, and Brenda, we first covered the taming of the horse, the invention of the wheel, and the story of bronze itself, culminating in that supreme example of innovative and effective integration of these technologies by the Proto-Indo-Europeans, who went on to dominate a good part of the vast stretch of land from India to Europe, leaving a permanent imprint by way of their traditions, genes, and most notably, perhaps, their language, which, in an evolved form, you are reading right here, 5,000 years later. We also went on to discuss the origins of writing, the emergence of institutions such as the state and markets, urbanization and standardization with the Indus Valley civilization as a case study, and then how, in the 1200s BC, it all came crashing down. Well, did it all come crashing down? Was that it? Was it the end? Not at all, of course. So let's step back and explore what exactly happened in the wider context of that entire period, but also in relevance to our own times. Why to our own times? Because that's what matters. The whole point of history is to understand our own realities better, to learn to live our own lives better. And furthermore, the whole point of this journey here is to understand how human innovation, progress, growth happened, so we can learn to do that even better now and in the near future. Let me pause to point out one epistemic fly in the ointment. When we are trying to understand any topic, especially the course of events across history, as here, we necessarily divide them into different phases or segments, categorize different parts into different classes. However, ultimately, this is just a tool of academic and epistemological convenience, and while it may be useful, it also introduces a slight distortion. Notwithstanding my facetious fictionalization in the account of Steve crafting the first stone tool, which can be generously proclaimed as the day the Stone Age started, in reality, it's not as clear-cut as that. That is just a necessary device, a rhetorical slight, if you will, in how the narrative is woven. In the same way, more often than not, when we talk about collapse or the end of a particular age or phase, it's the same thing. Notwithstanding the relative rapid turn of events in the cases we considered, the decline of the Indus Valley civilization, starting about 1900 BC, and the Bronze Age collapse just after 1200 BC, which seems sudden, just a few generations, particularly given the sheer scale and sophistication of those civilizations. I'll come back to this in TecC 30 on 22nd August. The recurring rhythm of ages, twixt utility and futility. Let's start with a more mundane instance of the ups and downs of human existence that persisted for much of our time on this planet. This was the phenomenon where technological advances led to increased production, which led to an increase in population, which led to a reduction in living standards again, which led to a decrease in population, and so on, cycle after cycle. This is called the Malthusian trap, named after its propounder, British cleric, economist, and scholar, Thomas Malthus, who lived and wrote around the same time as, rather slightly later, and thus a contemporary of his compatriot Adam Smith. Ironically, though, it was around the same time as he made this observation that the phenomenon itself was becoming obsolete, at least in Britain, thanks to events I've discussed in The Birth of Industry in TecC 06, a topic I intend to treat in far greater detail in due course. And even though we, at least in the industrialized world, have since escaped the Malthusian trap, I think it's worth remembering this, especially in the context of the older societies we are scrutinizing currently. And in particular, I'd mention a takeaway here, that before the industrial era, technological progress was not necessarily, in the medium term, a good thing for the people involved. It was just a part of the ebb and flow of life. So next time somebody complains with, "I hate technology," tell them about the Malthusian trap and how we've escaped it. Seasons that swing. Another pattern that emerges, and something I haven't sufficiently emphasized in the previous couple of articles, is the role of environmental factors such as climate in both the rise and fall of civilizations. A primary impetus for a great many of the developments and civilizations I've covered, and here under civilization I also include the non-urban ones, such as in the steppes, has been, yes, climate change. The onset of favorable climatic conditions encouraged the development, in our technocentric parlance, of both artifactual and institutional technologies, starting right from the agricultural revolution. Such development and progress have typically been under conditions of climate warming, environmental conditions favoring the growth of crops, leading to such a cascading effect. Of course, I perhaps don't have to talk much about the flip side of this, that a reversal of such favorable climatic conditions have contributed to the downfall of many of the same civilizations. There seems to be a fair amount of discussion related to this in recent times. However, one thing that stands out is that such decline has been precipitated by local or global cooling, rather than its better-known opposite trend, global warming. And this is in the time of pre-industrialized societies who had very little part in changing the climate, if any. Which then brings up the question, shouldn't we focus our current efforts in the area of managing climate change, regardless of whether it's in the direction of global warming or global cooling? Systems in sight. Another point I have touched upon in the previous episode, and thus will only briefly mention here, is what may be called systemic factors. I have said before that innovation is in good part an incremental phenomenon. It emerges as a result of a great many small improvements by several human actors, sometimes over a long period of time. That is the same with institutions as well. In other words, the world we live in, just as the world of the great Bronze Age civilizations, is made of technological artifacts and institutions that have emerged and evolved over time. That they are a lot more bottom-up than top-down. So the questions I'll throw up here start with, do we understand such emergent phenomena enough? The latest example of such emergence is machine intelligence in the form of these language models that can quite convincingly generate human speech and voice and visuals, including this very voice, yours sincerely, generative AI. And there is an ongoing discussion related to that field as to whether we understand their emergent behaviors sufficiently. But what about these older, existing ones? Do we understand them sufficiently in the first place? From setbacks to springbacks, from rout to revival, my endeavor in this series is to provide as much fodder as I can in such areas of discussion. I'll be Socratically annoying in throwing up questions. I don't claim to know the answers, but perhaps we can work on them together. My bit here is just a drop in the ocean. The study of the past, you might say it's become a catechism here, is to help us understand the present and guide us to building a better future. So let's take stock. The developments we have studied, going back 3,000 to 5,000 years or more, have been fundamental to explaining where we are today, and many of them, such as in the Bronze Age, have resulted in achievements far greater than most of us quotidianly recognize. I have lamented the loss of some of these grand achievements, which have only shards of clay to piece together from. But there have been other instances where it was not all lost. Despite the loss of writing after the Bronze Age collapse in the Aegean, the descendants of the Mycenaean Greeks retained a folk memory of that glorious past, right through the so-called Dark Ages of Greece into the Classical Age, where it could be written down again. I'm of course referring to those epics attributed to the person of Homer, although there wasn't probably a single historical person. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer preserved elements of Mycenaean life and events, albeit presented in the form of myth, such as the Siege of Troy, which more recently, in the last century or so, was unearthed to have had a historical foundation. Sadly, the Indus Valley civilization, or other great ones that perished or retreated, did not leave behind their own Homers. Well, not at least as we'd recognize them, but perhaps they all left a folk memory, however dim, which after lying dormant, resurfaced, perhaps with greater vigor and in a better way. And then in many cases, it may be that an innovation was completely forgotten, and then it arose, once more, independently, perhaps in a much better way this time as well. The writing systems of the Bronze Age, as we've discussed previously, were complex and cumbersome, and they were the sole prerogative of an elite, even priestly, class, cuneiform and hieroglyphics. The writing system that emerged after the Bronze Age collapse to take their place, which also we've discussed, was much simpler, around 22 to the 26 letters you see used to write this article, even today. Joseph Schumpeter, in his discussion of economic and entrepreneurial phenomena, is most famously associated with the term creative destruction, which taken broadly in the current context, can be seen as how newer ideas, innovations, and processes replace older ones, usually, but not always, as improvements. So yes, on the long march of human innovation and progress, there will be ups and downs, there will be laughter and pain, there will be sunshine and rain, but there will always also be Schumpeterian renewal. And as we embark on the next stage of our technocentric journey, join me as we explore a fresh start. Thanks for listening.